Hello, my most amazing scholars of truth, goodness, and beauty. How are you today? Today I'm talking with my 4G scholars, and we're going to stay on the topic of photography for a little bit longer. In today's art history video, I want to highlight one of the most famous photographers in the 1900s. Her name was Dorothea Lang. And what made her famous was a photo that she took called the Migrant Mother. Now you have to understand that Dorothea Lang didn't just take pictures of fancy people or things that were happy. Dorothea Lang was hired by the government to go and take photos to document a serious problem that was happening in the United States. It was the Great Depression, and she went out to photograph and document what was going on with the farmers out west and south. She went and traveled all over to find people who were struggling to make a living, and she photographed them so that people could understand and know the hard times that others were going through. So I'm going to start by showing you that photograph, and then I'm going to read to you a little bit more about Ms. Lang. This is the photograph called Migrant Mother that was taken by Dorothea Lang in 1936. This photo was published on many newspapers and magazines, and it caught the attention of the world because the look on that mother's face and the situation with her children looked so heartbreaking that people could not ignore it. Let's take a look a little more closely. You can see in her eyes a look that you may recognize. It's not a look of carefree happiness. It's not a look of anger, really. It's a look of worry and despair. Do you see the wrinkles in her forehead? The way she's kind of knitting her brow together, as they call it. Her eyebrows are kind of clenched inward. You can see the lines around her eyes, showing that she oftentimes has this look of worry on her face. You can notice that her children, with their heads turned, don't want to be photographed. They're dirty. You can see that their outfits are raggedy. There's holes. And if you look down here, you can see there's a third child. There's a baby that she's holding right here. And so you'll notice that she looks like an old woman with the wrinkles, but she's not that old because she has a baby and young children. So she's probably in her 30s, but she looks a lot older because she has been through so much trial and trouble. So the story of this is that Dorothea Lang was traveling around California trying to take photographs of different migrant farmers, and she saw a sign on the side of the road that said Pea Picker's Farm. And she decided not to go follow that sign. It was getting a little bit later, and she just decided to keep driving. But she couldn't get it out of her mind. And after driving down the road like 10 or 20 miles, she finally just stopped and turned around and went back because she couldn't get it out of her mind that she needed to go check out that farm. And this is the photograph that she took while she was there. Now there's other photographs in this series as well, and it kind of shows you a bigger picture of what is going on during this time. This is a photograph that shows what the bigger picture was with this family. You can see that they were living in a makeshift tent. So just a frame with some tarp over it. And they've got a few little belongings here, a chair and a box, a trunk to put some things in. And she's got 4 children. This is her oldest daughter. And then she's got these 2 and the baby. And you can just see that they are destitute and poor, and that they needed help. And so after Dorothea Lang took this photograph, and after people started realizing the situation that these migrant farmers were in, the government started trying to come up with programs that would help people out of these kinds of situations. And it took a while, but eventually the country came back out of the Great Depression. And this lady, the mother, went on to live until the 1980s. She was 80 years old before she passed away. So they did get some help and some relief. Dorothea Lang, written and illustrated by Mike Venezia. Dorothea Lang was born in 1895 in Hoboken, New Jersey. She lived during one of the unhappiest times in American history, the Great Depression. Dorothea's photographs from that period are some of the best known and most powerful pictures of the 20th century. The Great Depression began in 1929 and lasted for more than 10 years. No one had any idea it was coming or how it would change their lives. It was a time when almost overnight, millions of people in the United States lost their savings, jobs, and homes. Dorothea Lang's best-known photographs show the people and families who were affected most by the Great Depression. Dorothea had a way of picturing people in a caring, sensitive way that had rarely been seen before. Dorothea didn't even have to photograph people's faces to show the suffering and the loneliness many people felt at this time. Dorothea Lang grew up in a nice neighborhood in Hoboken. When she was 6 years old, she caught a serious disease called polio. Today, polio can be prevented, but in Dorothea's time, it disabled many children. Dorothea's right leg and foot were badly damaged, and she walked with a limp for the rest of her life. Dorothea could no longer run and jump like she had before. Some kids even made fun of her. Dorothea grew up feeling angry, sad, and embarrassed all of the time. When she became a photographer, Dorothea took a picture of her right foot. She said her damaged foot was the most important thing that had ever happened to her. Because of her foot, she always worked hard not to let her problems get her down, and that made her a stronger, more understanding person. Dorothea went to school in New York City, which was right across the Hudson River from Hoboken. Her mother worked as a librarian there. New York was much different from her own quiet neighborhood. It was crowded and exciting. Dorothea loved to study the interesting people she saw every day. Sometimes when she went to meet her mother after school, Dorothea had to walk through dangerous neighborhoods. Since she couldn't run fast, she invented a way to give herself a blank expression so that no one would notice her. She called it her cloak of invisibility. Later, Dorothea used her cloak to study people without them knowing she was even around. When Dorothea graduated from high school, she surprised everyone by announcing she wanted to be a photographer. Dorothea had never owned a camera or even taken a picture, but with her great imagination and interest in people, Dorothea knew she would do just fine. She started out by convincing a well-known New York portrait photographer to give her a job as an assistant. It wasn't long before Dorothea learned how to use a camera, develop film, make prints, and run a studio. After getting her confidence built up, Dorothea decided to travel around the world to learn more about people and to practice her photography. When she was 22 years old, Dorothea left New York with her best girlfriend. They made it only as far as San Francisco, California, though, because a pickpocket stole all their money. Dorothea ended up staying in San Francisco. She got a job right away in a department store and joined a camera club. Dorothea met and became friends with lots of photographers and artists. One of those friends offered to lend Dorothea enough money to start up her own portrait studio. Dorothea was thrilled to have the chance to run her own business. She soon became very successful, making unusual portraits of wealthy mothers and their children. Dorothea invited her friends to come over to her new studio every day after work. They enjoyed discussing the latest things happening in art and photography and listening to new jazz music on the phonograph. One of Dorothea's guests was the well-known Western painter Maynard Dixon. Dorothea enjoyed Maynard's company. He dressed like a cowboy and had all kinds of exciting stories to tell. Maynard and Dorothea fell in love and got married in 1922. Maynard and Dorothea had 2 sons, John and Dan. Even though Maynard was a loving father and husband, he often spent weeks and even months away from his family. While he was off painting pictures of deserts and mountains, Dorothea was left at home raising the boys, taking care of the house, and running the portrait studio. After years of doing this, Dorothea and Maynard finally agreed that their marriage wasn't working very well. They decided to live apart from each other, and in 1929 they sent their sons to a boarding school and rented separate studios. In 1933, during one of the worst years of the Depression, Dorothea noticed from her studio window dozens of men who were out of work. They were standing in a bread line waiting for a free meal. She decided to go out and photograph them. One of the pictures she brought back was called White Angel Bread Line. Dorothea put a print of it on the wall of her studio. When her friends asked her what she was going to do with photographs of starving homeless people, Dorothea told them she had no idea. All Dorothea knew was that she had to take more pictures to show what a serious problem the Great Depression was. Dorothea spent more and more time outside her comfortable studio. She often went to dangerous areas to photograph people who were tired and sometimes angry. This is when her cloak of invisibility really came in handy. One day, a friend suggested that Dorothea have a show of all the remarkable photographs she had been taking. In 1934, Dorothea had her first show at a small California gallery. At this exhibit, Dorothea's photographs could be seen for the first time by lots of people. One person who went to the show thought Dorothea's pictures would be perfect to go along with some articles he was writing. Paul Taylor was a college professor who was studying the problems people were having because of the Great Depression. Paul asked Dorothea if he could use one of her photographs for a government report he was writing. He then asked her if she would go along and work with him. Dorothea agreed. She couldn't wait to begin using her skills to help record the Great Depression. Dorothea and Paul made a great team. They worked hard gathering information from many of the thousands of migrant families who arrived in California every day. Most migrants were ordinary people who had lost their farms and homes. They traveled all over the country hoping to get jobs picking fruit, vegetables, or cotton. They were so poor that they often had to live in old tents or cardboard boxes without heat, running water, or much food. Dorothea took a picture of the migrant mother below. In it, you can almost feel how worried that mother was about her children's future and where they would get their next meal. This picture became one of the most famous photographs of the Great Depression. Dorothea and Paul sent their reports to Washington, D.C. This information was used by the United States government to convince more fortunate Americans that the migrant families needed help. Dorothea Lang divorced Maynard Dixon and married Paul Taylor in 1935. She lived to be 70 years old and spent most of the rest of her life traveling around the country with Paul, photographing people in America who were very poor and treated unfairly. Dorothea wanted to make sure no one would forget about them. The end.